this is understood, that Magnitsky sanctions don't target a particular country or state, that Magnitsky sanctions target major human rights violators, those who are engaged in gross human rights violations like extrajudicial executions, torture, crimes against humanity, and the like. And Boris Nemtsov, who you referenced, Margarita, played a crucial role in the establishment of Magnitsky sanctions in Canada, in the US, etc. And paid for it, I believe, also with his life with regard to that role that he played, among other things, in the Justice for Sergei Magnitsky movement. But one of the things he said in Canada, which was so important, because somebody said, aren't Magnitsky sanctions anti-Russian? He said, no, they are pro-Russian. They are in behalf of the Russian people. And that is true in whatever country we establish them. They are on the behalf of the citizens of that country. They are on the behalf of the pursuit of justice in that country, which leads me to a third point. And we need to understand the crucial role that parliamentarians have played and can play, both in the adoption of Magnitsky sanctions and then in the subsequent implementation of those sanctions. Magnitsky sanctions were adopted in Canada because of the parliamentary initiatives, parliamentary motions, parliamentary hearings, parliamentary adoption. And in fact, I remember on the cusp of when the votes were to take place in Parliament, Russian authorities warned Canada that if they were to enact Magnitsky sanctions, Russia would retaliate. And here the coming together of civil society with parliamentarians, our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, which has an all-party parliamentary group for human rights, convened, and we said, look, we cannot allow parliamentarians of Canada to be intimidated. We not only have to adopt Magnitsky sanctions, we have to adopt it unanimously to send a message that we won't be intimidated. And I'm delighted, as Bill Brown mentioned, that Magnitsky sanction legislation was adopted 277-0 in the House of Commons, replicated like that in the other house in the Senate, signed immediately into law by the Governor General. This was the parliamentary response to the Russian threat at that point. And so we need to understand the importance where civil societies work together with parliament and governments in that regard. Number 4, parliamentarians can play a crucial role in making the pursuit of justice not only a domestic priority, but a foreign policy priority. And here too, the importance of PGA and parliamentarians in this regard. Let me also reference that we recently founded the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, where we have parliamentarians from some 25 democracies to hold CCP's China accountable with respect to things such as the mass atrocities, if not acts constitutive genocide against the Uyghurs, the national security legislation re Hong Kong, etc., imprisoning more journalists than any other country in the world. And we have recommended in our hearings, in our meetings, the adoption of Magnitsky sanctions to sanction the particular Chinese officials that are involved, for example, in the mass atrocities against the Uyghurs or the national security legislation. Number 5, we need to appreciate that Magnitsky sanctions not only can combat impunity in the countries where the cultures of corruption and criminality take place, but they also protect, through the application of visa bans, through asset seizures and the like, they protect our sovereignty, our security, our economy, our citizens, our justice. And so really, you've got here a framework for democratic protection and renewal in every country in which such Magnitsky sanctions are adopted. Number 6, Magnitsky sanctions need to increasingly begin to be used to protect media freedom and to protect journalists. As Amal Clooney has pointed out in her landmark report on the use of Magnitsky sanctions to protect journalists and protect media freedoms, Magnitsky sanctions have rarely been used to protect media freedom. We now have to see that the protection of media freedom through the use of Magnitsky sanctions effectively means the protection of democracy, since media freedom is the lifeblood of a democracy. And so we have to change the paradigm, as Amal Clooney put it. We have to change the paradigm from impunity to accountability and hold those who are imprisoning, threatening, murdering journalists accountable. Number 7, moving to close, that Magnitsky sanctions can also be used to protect parliamentarians and human rights defenders who are increasingly under assault. And I want to commend PGA, and we're delighted to partner with them for the establishment of a rapid response team that can move quickly, where parliamentarians can move quickly, and where Magnitsky sanctions could be one of the tools and resources for that purpose. And finally, we need to engage the various intergovernmental alliances, and parliamentarians can do this. Whether we talk about the G7, whether we talk about the OSCE, whether we talk about the OAS, whether we talk about Asian Pacific, parliamentarians have to be at the forefront of engaging these governments, of engaging these alliances, and bringing them to adopt and implement Magnitsky sanctions. To, in a word, bring about, as I mentioned, not only justice for victims and accountability for human rights violators, but through that, the promotion and protection of our democracies on International Democracy Day. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Professor. You cover so many things, and I think now we are also being inundated by additional questions. But let me just stress one aspect that I consider very important here. You mentioned the fight against impunity. It's an area where PGA has developed leadership since 1989. And it is really what we see today, that the attacks on democracies are as such that there is almost a direct connection between the impunity of the perpetrators and the fact that certain regimes or groups can gain and maintain power at the detriment of the people. And what we are looking at first in PJ is the victims, the rights of the victims, the voice of the victims. I believe this is happening today as it was happening before the current pandemics, because we have sort of a natural disaster, the coronavirus outbreak worldwide, and we have a man-made disasters, normally made by men, not by women, let's call it man-made disaster, which is the attacks on democracy, on the rule of law and human rights, and the crimes associated and the impunity stemming from it. So I think we have a lot to say about it. One of the questions that came through, Bill, from a number of participants that yesterday sent us 35 questions is, what do we do with Magnitsky type sanctions in situations like, for example, the example was made Ecuador, or certain African countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and so on, where there are serious violations of human rights. There is a rampant examples of corruption, but we are not yet facing a full-fledged dictatorship or an oppressive regime that is controlling all aspects in society. So can the Magnitsky type sanctions be useful also in these types of cases?
Absolutely. So let me give you an example. South Africa. South Africa is not a dictatorship. South Africa even has a rule of law. But South Africa, over recent years, has been hijacked by three brothers called the Gupta brothers, working together with President Zuma, and effectively stripping from the state all sorts of resources that should have been enjoyed by the South African people. The South African judiciary and the South African regulators, for whatever reason, haven't been able, and this is something that everybody has known. This is not a mystery. This is not a there's not a other side to the story. Everybody has been suffering in South Africa because of this. But the South African judiciary and the South African government, for whatever reason, couldn't organize themselves to prosecute this this group of people. And so in the end, the only justice for the South African people has come from the United States, where the Gupta brothers were all placed on the global Magnitsky sanctions list. And it was remarkable, the day that it happened. It was like I mean, I could almost feel the applause from South Africa to the United States of the people saying, finally, there's some kind of justice being done. And so that's a perfect example. You don't need a sort of Chinese concentration camps to justify Magnitsky sanctions. You can have a situation like that. The purpose of these sanctions is to create justice and to fight impunity where impunity exists, and impunity could exist because of dictatorships, and it could exist because of a weak government or weak judiciary, or corruption within the government and corruption within judiciary. And so it's something which I think there's something like 26 countries that have had individuals sanctioned under the U.S. Magnitsky Act, and I hope that there'll be many more in the future.
Thank you, Bill. And Professor Kotler, there are a number of questions relating to the Canadian situation. Questions asking about whether we can assess the process of designation of individuals to be sanctioned as too slow, or if there are obstacles in implementing the Canadian law. So this is coming from a number of participants. I may also address to you and to Margareta the question about why in certain countries, especially in Europe, it has taken so much time for legislators, for governments to be supportive of this type of measures. If you see some obstacles that need to be, let's say, overcome before to move forward with these legislative processes. Professor Kotler.
Yeah, if I may, just to follow up also on Bill Browder, because it's a related thing. He mentioned South Africa, but I think the Philippines is another example which is engaged in not only in extrajudicial executions, but in threatening and imprisoning journalists who expose it, such as Maria Ressa of the Rappler. And it is a case study in the emerging threats of digital authoritarianism, of the weaponization of social media, where online hate leads to offline violence. And I think here we too, and parliamentarians, have a role to play to see that these technological behemoths like Facebook, that there is accountability. For example, in Canada, Facebook does not pay any taxes, is immune from suit and the like. And that's why I'm delighted that I believe Canadian parliamentarians are now considering legislation to combat hate on the internet, so as to protect from moving from online hate to offline violence. Now, you mentioned with regard to the Canadian situation and process of designation as being too slow. The process of designation must be deliberative, because we need to ensure also the appropriate due process protections. And right now, the process of deliberation is largely through the decision-making at the executive level and through the Minister of Foreign Affairs. What I do think we need a greater involvement of Parliament and expert groups of parliamentarians in the designation of those who should be targeted for Magnitsky sanctions. So a greater partnership between government and Parliament and civil society in that designated process. Sometimes it does become cumbersome, but that's part of the deliberative nature of democracy. What we want to do is to also make it more efficient and more democratic in its exercise and application.
Thank you, Irving. And what I've noticed from a recent statement of the Canadian government is that there is also, as a priority in the plan for 2020-2021, to make sure that the eventual assets that would be seized from abusers would be made available to victims and communities who have suffered the consequences of human rights abuses. So that is part of a mechanism that needs to be set up. I see Bill noting here, so I'm not wrong. But of course, I would also urge a consideration of the role that the judicial branch of government can play in this, given the fact that there are certain due process protections to be taken into account. Margareta, do you want to address maybe why in Europe we have seen a little bit of a slower process than in the English-speaking countries?
It's difficult to say, David, but thanks you very much for your question. And maybe because quite a lot of the European countries have strong constitutions with strong, that protect human rights. Maybe it's also that we have some glasses that protect us from seeing what goes on in the world. It might also be that there are countries who are not really, they are in authoritarian leadership that don't brighten the view. Or it might be that it's small countries. We are depending on bigger countries. That might be one point of view. But I must underline, don't only focus on the problem. Focus as well as the possibility. And I think what Bill Browder spoke about, it shows that one person can have an incredible impact on the situation. And I think that's the most important thing to focus on. What can each of us do? And also to build networks, to be in such an environment that you get inspired, that you want to do something, to act. It's maybe not for a parliamentarian to have this environment in their own country. Then be active in international organization to get empower, to get fact, to get inspiration, because it's possible to change. And that's what Bill Browder have really shown and talk about all the time. And this is important. Thank you, David.
And thank you, Margareta. And of course, the role of parliamentarians has been addressed by many, many actors. One of them is listening to us today, maybe the most important man who is in our participants list, the former Undersecretary General and Legal Counsel of the United Nations, Ambassador Hans Corell from Sweden, who published a rule of law guide for politicians. That is also a very, very important tool that PGA and all the parliamentarians of the world should make use of to promote human rights and accountability. It's a project that he did with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Lund University, together with the Hague Institute for the Internationalization of Law in the Netherlands. You can find it easily on the internet, and we'll put on the PGA website a link to it. Now,
David, may I just say one thing more? I think what Irving Kotler spoke about, to involve parliamentarians, is crucial, because it's not that the government, if it's a democratic country, the government haven't the power. They are those who are running the country, but the legislative power is in the parliament, and the parliaments have possibilities to take initiatives, and are also those who scrutinize the government. So I think what Irving Kotler said is really important. Parliamentarians has to be involved and also to act responsible. Thank you.
Absolutely. And many questions have been asking, and talking to especially Professor Kotler and Bill Browder here. Maybe Bill can have the last word on this. Are these Magnitsky type sanctions effective as a tool for prevention or deterrence? If we look at situations like Venezuela, for example, where a lot of efforts have been made, but a parallel economic system has been created by the Maduro regime to find ways and means to sell the oil. What other toolbox? What is this an essential component of the broader toolbox that policymakers, governments, parliamentarians, international organizations should have at their disposal to fight impunity and prevent gross abuses? What else can be most complementary to the Magnitsky type legislation and sanctions? I would give first the floor to Professor Kotler and then to Bill Browder.
Well, let me just take a particular example that you mentioned with respect to Venezuela, because I think Magnitsky sanctions were here imposed by Canada on the leaders of Venezuela, both as a means of deterrence as well as a means of securing justice for victims and accountability. But it has to also be done in concert. I was a part of an OAS panel of independent experts, which were asked to look into whether there are reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity are being committed in Venezuela. We reported a little over 2 years ago that there are reasonable grounds to believe that 7 major crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela, in particular state-orchestrated humanitarian sufferance, the weaponization of food and medicine and targeting the opposition, etc. We were delighted that some 6 months after our report, some 7 countries made the first ever collective referral of a state party to the ICC, International Criminal Court, Venezuela, in its history. Now, here is the complementarity of Magnitsky sanctions and reference to the International Criminal a court where some of the information used in the adoption of Magnitsky and implementation of Magnitsky was also used with respect to the developing the breach of facts and law in that regard. And the PGA has been very involved in the promotion and protection and pursuit of justice at the ICC. So this is how one can work in concert in that regard. But one other thing, while we have been very active in Canada in a matter of Venezuela and Magnitsky sanctions and the like, we have not yet, in fact, invoked any Magnitsky sanctions with respect to any CCP officials in Xi Jinping's China or any of the senior officials in Iran. And we cannot in any way somehow indulge a culture of impunity by applying it in some cases and not applying it in others. I know there are foreign policy considerations sometimes that come into it, but we need to act in concert as a community of democracies, so no country needs to stand alone, and parliamentarians can be the bridge builders and the nexus to bringing governments and parliamentarians together.
Thank you, Professor. Bill.
So the original concept of sanctions was for a Western government to express its displeasure by sanctioning another country. And that was an extremely blunt instrument, very hard to do because it required a huge amount of political will. And it often, and almost always, ended up targeting the victims of the dictatorship, not the dictators. You know, when we sanctioned Iran, they were flying in plane loads of caviar and champagne for the top guys, and the people were suffering. The idea of Magnitsky sanctions turns the whole thing on its head. It says, let's leave the people alone. Let's leave the people who are living in an occupied country, occupied by criminals and dictators. Let's leave their victims alone. And let's specifically and surgically target the perpetrators, the individuals who are causing all the pain and all the death and all the suffering. And I get asked this all the time. How do you know it works? And there's a million ways I know it works, but the best way I can tell you why it works is how angry Putin got when we did it. He literally, I mean, he never loses his cool. He's always steely cool, just staring down. He lost his cool and has continued to lose his cool when it came to Magnitsky sanctions. And the reason he lost his cool is because a huge part of his motivation of being in power and being a dictator is to steal money. And he kills a lot of people, he imprisons a lot of people, he tortures a lot of people for money. Money is more important than human life to him. He keeps that money not in Russia, in the West. And all of a sudden, we now have a mechanism to put that money at risk. And for him, that's just horrifying. And I can tell you, on the basis of the reaction to the people who have been added to the Magnitsky sanctions list, their reaction is so clearly affected, so high, so emotional, that we know we're onto something good. Sometimes people say, well, look, you know, Putin continues doing all of his terrible things, so obviously this stuff doesn't work. And I would say, well, that's true, he does do his terrible things, but how do we know what more terrible things he might have done if he wasn't afraid of this coming down? And I would also say that if we were to sanction more people in his regime, he might do less terrible things in the future. And of course, I'm talking about Putin, but this applies to China, this applies to Iran, this applies to Venezuela, this applies to anybody. They all hate it. They're all, and it's really interesting because a lot of times these people, these dictators, don't even know about the Magnitsky Act until one of them gets sanctioned. And then all of a sudden they're running around like chickens with their heads cut off, all saying how unfair it is and how extrajudicial it is and so on and so forth when they finally get affected. And then the local press goes crazy and says, who's going to be next and so on and so forth. And they're all, you know, looking in the mirror, wondering if they're going to be next. And what this does is it creates a sort of, it evens the balance. I mean, of course, they have 99, they had 100% of the power. Now they have 99% of the power, but we've given 1% of the power back to the victims, back to the people who are being persecuted. And hopefully if this thing continues to be used and implemented, then maybe it goes from 1% to 10%. And it's It's never going to be a fair fight, but it's a lot better than total impunity.
Yes, thank you, Bill, and certainly a measure of justice is absolutely an imperative. When we saw the type of policy that the Assad regime of Syria started to implement against its own people during the so-called months of the so-called Arab Spring, when essentially, thanks to the patronage and the coverage that Mr. Putin gave to Mr. Assad, we witnessed the killing of approximately 500,000 people and the decision of maybe 5 million people to become refugees in the largest and the bloodiest conflict known to this century and so far a millennium. So this is unfortunately the very same person that is behind the single assassination on one side, or the attempted one on the other side, or widespread and systematic crimes against humanity. I think we are exhausting our time, and I would like to give maybe 1 minute to each of you to maybe make a comment. Before doing so, I would like to thank those who supported the realization of these events, all the staff of PGA and the Raoul Wallenberg Center, who worked as a wonderful team. This will also be, is already available on YouTube, but will also be available in the future, unless, of course, anyone here would object. Also a big thank you to Global Affairs Canada that supports the PGA campaign for democratic renewal and human rights in partnership with the Raoul Wallenberg Center. And let me also mention the fact that PGA continues in its very strong commitment to fight impunity for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole. It's absolutely unacceptable that a single murderer in the streets of Rome, under my house here in the face of the Vatican, will be brought to justice 90% of the cases. And those who are killing 100,000 in Yemen or in other places can rest on the fact that there will be impunity for, in Syria, of course, there will be impunity for them. So we need to absolutely change this paradigm and bring justice to make sure that globalization and the rule of law apply equally to all and not only to the privileged ones. So today we maybe have not touched upon a number of questions on a number of situations, especially in the global south, but I think the commitment is there from our side to continue the dialogue, and we'll certainly organize another one of these webinars. I now give the floor to you, probably in an alphabetic order, if you don't mind. Bill.
I'm not going to take my full minute, but I will say that if there are members of parliament listening today whose country there's no Magnitsky initiative currently going on, please perhaps get in touch with me via Davide so that we can talk about how we can make this happen. It all started with me in Canada. It all started me with meeting Erwin through a random friend of introduction at the Houses of Parliament in London 10 years ago, and perhaps there'll be somebody listening today where we can make it happen in your country. So thank you. Absolutely. Thank you, Davide and Margarita and Erwin for allowing me to join you on this important call.
Margareta.
Thank you, David. Could you please repeat your question once again?
Oh,
it was
I'm just giving a minute. I'm just giving a minute to close to everyone.
I would like to say, listening to Irvin Kotler and Bill Browder, I have got a lot of thoughts, and I hope all my fellow parliamentarians have done the same. But what can we do? Support a political system that's transparent. Support a political system that really make difference and that promote accountability, and also that those like the Magnitsky Act don't follow the laws, don't respect the people to do those crimes. Don't accept it. Build network as parliamentarian. Join, for example, PGA. Read. Get in touch with Bill Browder, but do something, because that's what our voters That's what our people could expect from us as parliamentarians. And also, as parliamentarian, remember, why did you go to politics? Why did you put so much time, so much effort? It's not to sit, it's to make difference, to act. And I think I have said what's important for me. Think about rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Margareta. And I've seen that there are other questions. What I can say before that Professor Kotler really closes the meeting is that in our view, what we are doing today is to bring about more support, more leverage to the idea that Magnitsky sanctions should be adopted and utilized. Let's remember that we live in a real world informed by discourse around trade, business, national interest. The international interest relating to the human rights of human beings is a little bit not given the same importance in many mainstream by many mainstream actors. So that's our role here, to really push the envelope as far as we can. Now, there is the point that is being made by some of our participants here. What do we do to advance the sanctions regimes from the side of the developing countries where the abuses are committed? So here there is much more thinking that we need to maybe, I would propose that this should be the topic of our next webinar with individuals who can help us to go through technical procedures according to which in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, activists, lawyers, politicians can group together and create the conditions for action and a liaison with the countries in which this legislation exists and where these type of measures can have an impact on those who are abusing human rights of their own people. So that's the commitment that I can put on the table. Professor Kotler.
Thank you, David. I think that parliamentarians in concert with civil society, we have a unique opportunity, also a unique responsibility at this point to build a constituency of conscience, to build a constituency of action that is anchored in and inspired by the Magnitsky sanctions movement, and to do so in order to both combat impunity and secure justice for victims, as well as accountability for the violators. That is the best testimonial that we can make for the International Day for Democracy, and thereby secure democratic renewal and resilience.
Thank you, Professor. And you gave us really the best possible words to close this event. For us, this event is a starting point. For Bill, of course, it's one of the hundreds that he might have contributed. And the same, of course, applies to Professor Kotler. But for PGA, even though we have been doing a lot in support of democratic principles, the rule of law, the fight against impunity, this area of sanction is one where we want to engage in a constructive way, in a continued way, within the framework of our strategic plan, and trying to broaden the conversation to a lot of our members. So let's hope to have soon good news, Bill, from Brussels, that at least all the 27 EU member states will have the same regulation to be applied all together, not only the Baltic states or the UK, which is exiting, to take action in this crucial field. The Parliament spoke very eloquently about it, and I'm sure that the European External Action Service will put on the table a very interesting regulation, also in line with the human rights and due process. And let's maybe, Professor Kotler and Margareta Sederfeld, let's make a new appointment, maybe in a couple of months from today, involving some of our today's participants. Maybe the next webinar shouldn't be really a webinar, should be much more of a Zoom meeting with a lot of faces and a lot of interactions, so to move forward and bring this to a more dynamic and working level. I really thank everyone, and happy International Day of Democracy to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you.